Yeah, I'm very much going to look at prevention of pollution from a local authority perspective, given that most of our networks are very diverse in nature, predominantly of an evolved nature, where we're lucky if we have a massive amount of information on our drainage asset and the way it deforms. I'm going to look at some of the work we've been doing in Staffordshire in recent years, mainly focused actually on flood risk management. But when you look at what we've been doing from a flood risk management point of view, there's clear benefits and links of actually how that minimises the risk of pollution. What I'm also pleased to see is the links throughout the presentations today. You're always last in the day and you're thinking, have you joined the links together? Are you going to bring a totally different message? So I was really pleased to see when we started this morning with salt as being one of the listed pollutants on the highway network. So we'll cover that shortly. Just to give you a bit of context to the county of Staffordshire. Rural in nature, about 80% rural, sits in the heart of the country, runs from Birmingham up to the Peak District, about a 4,000 mile network, 60 miles north to south, and an asset estimated to be worth about 6.5 billion. That's the asset that we actually know of. Got about 170,000 gullies, reasonably sure on that, but we've got a yet as unknown length of highway drainage. Very diverse in nature. We've got the FA Centre that's just opened at St George's Park outside Burton. You've probably seen that, so that'll give you some context to where it is. Dependent very much on tourism, rural agriculture, but we've also got some quite heavy industry such as JCB and Alstom. So it's very, very varied. River Trent runs through the county, starts in the north, goes southwards, turns back on itself, disappears out east of the county through the town of Burton, which you might know is famous for its brewing. So water quality in Staffordshire is actually quite important to us. We deliver the highway service through a virtual joint venture. Again, you'll see why I've mentioned that later on. It's on a cost plus arrangement with our contractor. We spend about £50 million a year. So hopefully that'll give you a little bit of a background to the kind of network that we operate in Staffordshire. We've talked about most of these issues today. I'm not actually going to cover all of them. Really just to reiterate, as far as highway is concerned, we are talking mainly about high volume, low concentration runoff, diffuse pollution. Spillages obviously we do get from time to time. Not going to deal with those today because they are very reactive in the way that we deal with them. I'm sure we've all got emergency plans and so on in place to deal with that. We also use a variety of materials in the actual operations that we do on our network, ranging from the day-to-day maintenance and improvement activities through to such activities as winter maintenance and weed control. So I'm going to have a look at some ways that we can actually minimise some of those pollutions by working differently. As a presentation was presented by CIRIA, or arranged on behalf of CIRIA, but just have a look to see what actually research was done. How much sediment are we actually collecting through our highway network? Because, as I said earlier on, most of our networks actually evolved in nature, and we don't, at this stage, have too many source controls, such as permeable pavements and swales and grass channels and ponds and so on. So our first line of defence for our network, and probably our first line of defence for many, many years to come in terms of a percentage of the whole, will actually be the gully pot and the associated maintenance regime that goes alongside it. So apart from their obvious function to take the water off the highway, as we know, their main aim is to actually trap the sediment and prevent the network getting blocked. The research I found actually was from CIRIA about 15 years ago. Couldn't find anything else more recent. And it did show, it's quite interesting, some of the observations earlier on about the effectiveness of the different ways of trapping solids, that it did show that actually gullies reduce the total mass of solids entering the sewer or receiving water by nearly 3/4. And that, as we would expect, whilst the pots are most effective at retaining the coarse solids, they do actually trap a significant amount of the fine solids that collect many of the pollutants, the other pollutants that we're talking about. The interesting thing for me was it also showed that there was no significant improvement in discharge quality, even if the pots were cleaned every week, and therefore noted that the cleaning frequency should not be chosen on water quality grounds, but to prevent the pot from becoming full of sediment. Common sense to be, let's stop the pot filling up in the first place, and that will do the better job. So with that in mind, it sort of reinforced what we've been doing in Staffordshire recently, that well, why actually can't we consider a better risk management approach to the emptying of gullies and actually achieve the twin benefits of reducing the risk of highway flooding and also pollution. It was also interesting to me that the research talked about there should be more emphasis on cleaning gully pots more thoroughly and on minimising the pollutant impact rather than on cleaning them quickly. And I suppose that's a challenge I'm going to lay down to many of us in the room today, to actually have a think about the behaviours that we drive through the kind of contract mechanisms and payment rates that we have in place for our gully emptying service. If we operate on a price per item, does that actually drive behaviours in our contractor to get as many gullies emptied in the day as possible, perhaps at the expense of making sure that those gullies are correctly emptied, or the gully is correctly emptied and the drainage system leading off the gully is also working properly. So there's a challenge there, I think, for all of us to think what behaviours does our contractual mechanisms drive? Should they be focused more on outcomes rather than outputs? And of course there's also the challenge that currently the National Code of Practice for Well-Maintained Highways does recommend a risk-based approach, but also a default position that all gullies should be cleansed annually. So equally, perhaps it's time that we actually looked at the Code of Practice and challenged that to keep up actually with the way other authorities, in addition to Staffordshire, are already starting to work. So, yeah, it's not our new technique actually on the right-hand side. Tried to find a picture of an old gully emptier working, but that was the closest I'd get, a street cleaning vehicle. So where did we start? Well, in Staffordshire we decided we were going to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to managing the drainage asset. But actually, what should that regime look like? Well, we started the project about 2 years ago to look at the way we manage the cyclical maintenance of our drainage network, primarily, as I say, driven by flood risk management. But we needed to increase visits at some locations, pretty common message, I think, for all of us, but also deal with decreasing revenue budgets. As we've seen, limiting the levels of pollution from gullies is more about preventing them becoming full, and the thoroughness of cleaning was also important to give us those two twin benefits. So we very much focused on what we wanted to achieve based upon those outcomes. Being realistic, before we started the project, our policy was to empty all the gullies once a year, but we weren't actually achieving that. We had some asset data from our vehicle tracking systems, but we had doubts about how accurate that was, both in terms of location and quantum. And so we set about the project following systems thinking lean improvement techniques, resulting now in a risk-based approach with new routes that are underpinned by data from the National Street Gazetteer. So we've got a common platform using the existing traffic data in the geographic information system. Very important through that business improvement process was the involvement from the crews and the supervisors that were actually delivering the job on the ground. Last thing we wanted to do was to come up with a totally different regime that they didn't buy into, they didn't get the ownership for, because we knew we wouldn't achieve the results. We've also been able to improve the scheduling of lots of our reactive works alongside the cyclical work. So we've reduced the amount of unproductive time, the dead running time across the service. Better management of customer expectations, because we've got improved visibility of the programmes so that we can answer the customer enquiries. I'm not sure whether you'll actually be able to see some of these slides very well, so I do apologise. I think that the colour's not great. First thing we took a look at was, okay, so if we're going to develop this risk management based approach, what factors are we going to consider? What information do we have? And equally, what information does other people have, such as the Environment Agency, for example? We got a massive customer data, local knowledge within our teams ourselves that we used. We dragged all that data across. Most of it, fortunately, was geographically referenced, so we could drag it across into a map-based system. We took fluvial flooding maps, that 1 in 30-year flood maps, together with road classification information, and actually used that as a starting point to develop this risk-based approach. And that was when we first started to combine some of the information together on on this GIS platform. In parallel to that, one of the big things that we saw was that we were spending an awful lot of money on traffic management. We believe we could certainly do something differently, and we could take advantage of some of the slight changes in the national codes of practice. So we actually divided our network up into 4 traffic management categories. The most simplest, the vehicle operating by itself. The second one, which is the vehicle on the right hand side, where previously that would have operated with a separate amber arrow and possibly a crash cushion behind it. That now operates on itself. We've got another category where we use these, we call them mules, not quite sure what they're used on the left hand side. They provide mobile stop go. They basically allow us to do more quickly. We can move the traffic management on quickly. And of course on some of the high speed dual carriageways that we maintain, we've still got the crash cushion and full traffic mobile working that goes with that. So we took those traffic management categories and we took the risk management approach, put the two together. The change in frequency actually means that all the classified roads we still continue to visit once a year, no change there. But our non-classified network is now managed on a risk-based approach. Some of those locations we will be going down to a frequency now of once in every 4 years. We've done some testing with our laboratory to see actually how quickly some of these gullies are filling up, and we believe that's achievable. What it's also done is given us the increased capacity that we wanted to be able to visit some locations more than once a year, and we've been able to do that without increasing the total resource that we've got available, which is one of our primary concerns. That's just an example of some of the data that we've got available from the system. Of course, even having done all that, got to know your own limits. We're not going to prevent that kind of thing by changing to a risk-based approach from gully empty. That is in Staffordshire, and it's in Staffordshire last Friday where we had a bus get washed out on the road. So yeah, we've just got to be mindful of our own limitations. We're never going to achieve that. So what does it look like on the ground? We also wanted very much to focus on, as I say, local communities and better information for those local communities in terms of when we're actually going to do our visits. So we split the county into about 280 zones based on local communities, typically 600 gullies in an urban zone, 400 gullies in a rural zone, with separated routes out for the specialist traffic management. So that means we can get maximum effectiveness in terms of the use of the very special traffic management techniques, the category 3 and 4 as we would call it. So apart from our reactive flooding incidents, our reactive gully defects, anything else to do with drainage now is given a 28-day priority. That gives us flexibility to plan works and wherever possible incorporate them into the schedules. Probably didn't show up very well on the diagram, but I'm sure if you look at the presentations afterwards when they're uploaded, you'll see there's a number of what looks like red lightning strikes on there, possibly. They're actually data that comes across overnight from our defect system, which comes across from our customer system, so they get taken into this database every night. So when the schedules are produced on a weekly basis, the crews also get details of any reactive issues that are in that 28-day category, so they can do them basically whilst they're in the zone. Again, it's probably not going to show up very clear, but it's really to illustrate that as well as pushing information out to the crews, we do get data back via vehicle tracking. That's regularly uploaded again back into this database. We get a variety of data associated with that. Again, it's not clear on the legend, but to give you an idea, block connections, jam lids, and also we distinguish between the length of time that we've actually taken at each location to empty a gully. So it gives an indication of how full the gully potentially is. We do have an eye on targets. As I said, the zones are based on 600 or 400 gullies per zone, and we do have an eye on those targets, but there is a real emphasis on actually the outcome rather than the output. As you saw in one of the earlier photographs, because the vehicles are also fitted up with jetting equipment, the aim is to do it right first time. Most of the costs associated with gully emptying actually tend to be getting the vehicle there in the first place. And if you're going to give up because you're on an output-based kind of activity very, very quickly, when perhaps 2-3 minutes more with the jetter would have freed it, actually overall that probably doesn't make sense. So we keep an eye on targets, but it's very much based upon quality of what we're doing rather than that fixed you will achieve 600 gullies in a week, etc. We've been running that system now for about 18 months with the new frequencies. Quite challenging actually to actually look at the impact that that's made because of the quite strange variations in weather obviously we've had over the last few months. Very dry spells, very wet spells, very difficult to actually monitor the customer impact. But anecdotally, most of our team that are on out of hours call, who usually used to take the brunt of, you could usually reckon if the bad weather was going to happen, if it was going to come down heavily with rain, it would be out of hours rather than within the working day. So most of our call out teams are actually saying that, yeah, they are now getting less calls and they are not getting the calls from the flooding hotspots that they used to. So anecdotally, there's some support that the regime is actually starting to work. Moving on from the way we've changed our risk management approach, instead of just take a quick look at actually what can we do as highway authorities to reduce some of the pollutants that we're putting onto our network in the first place. And apart from the big risk from spillage from the kind of maintenance or improvement activities that we do, two areas I just want to quickly look at: winter maintenance and the use of salt, and weed control. I think it's fair to say winter maintenance has moved on significantly in recent years. I think it will move on even further in the next few years. Better technology, better forecasting, road sensors, make sure that vehicles are only deployed when necessary. Some authorities have already moved to route-based forecasting, which allows you to target when you send your vehicles out and where you send your vehicles out to. Is the next step that we will go for GPS-based systems that not only allow you to tie it down to routes, but sections of roads within that route, because that would then reduce the amount of salt that we're using further. We've also seen the guidance by the County Surveyors Society last 2 winters ago, enabling us to reduce spread rates for precautionary salting. And of course, if we can also seek the capital funds to put salt in our barns, then we reduce the amount of salt stored in the open, and we can spread again at low rates, so another way of reducing the pollutant load on the network. In Staffordshire we've moved over to pre-wetted salt now for about half of our depots. Not sure how many people in the room are actually using pre-wetted salt. I could ask that question. Show of hands, I suppose. How many are using pre-wetted salt already? Oh, surprisingly not many. Yeah, I thought there might have been a few more than that. We've moved over to pre-wetted salt, about half the county. Just to quote some figures again in terms of how much that can reduce the amount of salt, because that's what we're working on. For a 10 gram normal spread, that would comprise of 7 grams of salt, 3 grams of brine on a 70-30 split. The brine concentration is normally about 23%, which I reckon gives an equivalent of 7.7 grams of salt on the network. So again, a reduction in actually the pollutant load that we're putting down in the first place. So just some food for thought. Moving on to weed control. I guess in like Staffordshire, most people use herbicides, glyphosate probably, to treat weed growth on the network. We still do that, obviously. But increasingly, as for most of us, we very much work a lot more closely with our local communities now than we've done ever, I think it's fair to say. We've historically had a scheme called the Parish Lensman Scheme, which is where we actually provide some money to local parish councils for them to employ usually somebody part-time to actually deal with real local issues on their network. And one of the issues that we actually like them to focus on is removal of weed growth. Removal of weed growth and, I think more importantly, the kind of silt and debris that often leads to that weed growth in the first place. And what we do there, we also join up with the district councils who provide part funding for that, so that we as a highway authority are not completely taking the hit on what you might argue actually is a district council street cleansing function. So we get the benefit that we actually get less weed growth in the first place. We've also developed what we call our neighbourhood highway teams, which again, one of the things that we allow those neighbourhood highway teams to target is weed growth on the network. So overall, through involving the local communities in the first place on a more targeted approach, we're actually reducing the amount of treatment that we have to do on the network in terms of chemical treatment to keep weed growth down to a reasonable level. Because when we've done all that, we've got to deal with the waste that we produce. I was interested to say about the context of, do gullies really perform the function? Do they trap sediment? Well, we take away about 3,000 tonnes a year of waste in Staffordshire from our gullies, so they must be doing something. A few years ago, we were taking all that waste out of the county to a landfill site. Okay, it was an appropriate licensed landfill site to take that material, but obviously long term, does that leach, does that get back into watercourses, does that add to pollution? We were taking about 4 hours on average to do that round trip, so we put a business case forward for a new facility in the centre of Staffordshire, which we did in conjunction with a household waste centre. That was to de-water the gully waste material within Staffordshire, and at that time the licensing in terms of the waste allowed us to commingle the dried solids with a compost that was produced local to that facility. Changes in the legislation meant that we were no longer able to do that, so we've had to come up with another solution. That's just a couple of pictures of the facility itself, just to illustrate. I mean, it's quite simple. We discharge the material, drains out over a series of channels and weirs. We settle out as much solids as we can out of the liquid before it gets charged into the sewer network. The remaining material dries out, and I'll tell you what we now do with that material in a second. There are some other authorities that are actually treating the liquid, the water, the runoff, the grey water. They're actually treating that through what they call a living water process, which is where it goes through filtration beds and the kind of swale type arrangement that we've seen. What we've now done with our solid waste is we take that down to a regional facility. This is all the sediment containing a lot of the pollutants that we're talking about. We separate out the coarser elements. They can go back off to construction materials. We separate out the sand. The finer sediment is taken out. It becomes a bit like a cake. That can be combined with material for landfill remediation. The water that comes off it is treated with flocculants and other chemicals, so we take out a lot of the remaining chemicals within that. Basically, it recycles about 98% of the material that comes in. And that's a regional facility. It doesn't just take the gully waste, it actually takes street sweepings as well from the region. Apart from the benefits of recycling, it's about half the cost of landfill tax plus gate fee, so we're on a win there in terms of the environment and also the cost savings. Stephen this morning actually, the interest talked about Chesapeake Bay. I was trying to find some images just to illustrate, which do we want, and actually the banner on the left hand side is from Chesapeake Bay, where the local community were pushing for legislation to prevent the kind of pollutants going in every time it rains. So yes, we've still got that question of, do we want on the left or do we actually want on the right? I think we can, through a lot of what we do already, work very closely with other organisations and demonstrate that we're already moving towards on the right, but we do need to challenge what we all do. We can do that. We need to be innovative. We need to work differently. But I believe we're probably further along that route than we actually believe we are. I'm just going to leave you with one last thought, because at the end of the day, all this material, as we say, goes into the watercourse. And I just thought a quote from Wind in the Willows was probably quite apt in terms of what Mole and Ratty thought about rivers. Thank you.